The diner smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. Two things I knew well. I'd been working the late shift at Carmine's Diner on the corner of 5th and Hollow for 3 years. Long enough to memorize the squeak of the third floorboard near table 7. Long enough to know that the neon sign outside buzzed louder whenever it rained. Long enough to have stopped dreaming about anything bigger than surviving until next Thursday. My name is Sarah Callahan, 26 years old. One bad student loan, one dead-end apartment with a leaking radiator, and exactly 0 romantic prospects worth mentioning. My life was unremarkable by design. I had learned, after years of chaos in my childhood, that unremarkable was safe. Unremarkable meant nobody noticed you. Nobody noticed you meant nobody hurt you. That philosophy worked perfectly, until the night you walked through my door. It was a Tuesday, just after 11. The rain had started around 9. The kind of New York rain that doesn't fall so much as assault. Sideways, relentless, indifferent to umbrellas and dignity alike. Most of our regulars had already cleared out. The booths sat empty except for old Mr. Tundy, Feeney nursing his decaf in the corner, and a couple sharing a slice of pie near the window, fogging the glass with their breath. I was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door chimed. I didn't look up immediately. I had a system, finish the task, then greet. 3 years of working for tips had taught me efficiency over instinct, so I finished the pass with my cloth, straightened up, fixed my smile, and turned toward the door. The words, "Welcome to Carmine's," died somewhere between my brain and my throat. He was tall, the kind of tall that commands a room without trying, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, his dark hair damp from the rain, plastered in a way that somehow looked deliberate rather than disheveled. His jaw was sharp enough to cut. His eyes, dark, almost black in the diner's amber light, moved through the room with the slow, calculating sweep of someone who didn't just enter spaces. He assessed them, claimed them. He wasn't alone. 2 men flanked him, big, stone-faced, wearing earpieces that they didn't bother to hide. They scanned the diner like wolves reading a clearing for threats. One hand from the man on the left rested inside his jacket, and I had been alive long enough to know what that meant. But it was the third figure that stopped my breath entirely. A little girl. She was small, maybe 7 or 8, with thick dark hair pinned back with a white bow that had come slightly undone, letting one loose curl fall against her cheek. She wore a white dress with a small pink cardigan. She was beautiful, in that heartbreaking way that some children are, too still, too watchful, holding something inside their eyes that children her age shouldn't have to carry. She held a blue crayon in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. The man, her father. I realized from the way his hand rested protectively on her shoulder. Guided her toward the booth near the back. His men took up positions at either end of the diner without a word, without being asked. Pure choreography. Old and practiced. I stood there for 2 full seconds, cloth still in my hand, doing the mental math that every woman instinctively does when danger enters her radius. Threat assessment. Exit routes. Stay calm. Then I picked up 2 menus and walked over. Good evening. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Nasty night out there. Can I get you something to start? Coffee? Hot chocolate for... The little girl looked up at me. I stopped. Her eyes were enormous, dark like her father's, framed by thick lashes still damp from the rain. She stared at me with an intensity that felt ancient for her face. Not fear exactly. Something more layered. Something searching. She didn't speak. The man across from her, the monster in the expensive suit, looked up from whatever he'd been reading on his phone and met my eyes. Up close, the impact of him was worse. The symmetry of his features was almost cruel, like nature had spent too long on his face and forgotten to add any softness. A small scar ran through the left side of his jaw, faint but deliberate looking, the kind left by something intentional. 2 coffees, he said. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't ask. It informed. 1 hot chocolate. Extra marshmallows. That last part, extra marshmallows, landed like a crack of light through stone. He'd said it without looking away from me, without softening his tone, but the words themselves betrayed something. He knew her preferences. He'd said them automatically without thinking. It was the most human thing about him. And somehow it was the most dangerous. "Of course," I managed. "I'll be right back." I turned toward the counter, exhaling slowly, grateful for the short journey across the diner to collect myself. My hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady as I reached for the mugs. "Get it together, Sarah." I prepared the drinks, piled an embarrassing mountain of marshmallows into the small mug. House policy, I told myself. Nothing to do with the child's still, sad eyes, and carried the tray back to their booth. The little girl was drawing, head bent over the paper she brought in, her blue crayon moving in careful, deliberate strokes. Whatever she was making, she was focused completely, in the way children concentrate when something matters deeply to them. I set the hot chocolate gently beside her, close enough that she could reach without shifting. She looked up, held my gaze, then, with a solemnity that made something tighten in my chest, she pushed the folded paper across the table toward me. I glanced at her father. He was watching his phone again, jaw tight, unreachable. I unfolded the paper. My blood went cold. The drawing was simple, the way a child draws what they don't have words for, a stick figure in a white dress, bars around her, a man with a gun standing at the door. Beneath it, in careful, uneven letters, she had written, "Help me." I looked up. The little girl was watching me, not pleading, not panicked, just watching with those enormous ancient eyes, waiting to see if I was the kind of person who would understand. Her father looked up from his phone at that exact moment. His eyes met mine, and I had absolutely no idea what kind of man I was looking at. I folded the paper. Fast, casual, like it was a receipt, like it was nothing, my hands performing a competence. My mind absolutely did not feel. I tucked it into my apron pocket with what I hoped looked like the automatic gesture of a waitress clearing clutter, and I smiled. The professional smile, the one that said everything is fine in exactly the tone that meant nothing at all. "Can I get you gentlemen anything else?" I asked, looking at neither the man nor the child, instead addressing some neutral point between them. "We're fine." His voice hadn't changed, low, flat, final. I walked back to the counter on legs that felt like poured concrete. "Help me." 2 words. 7 letters. In blue crayon, in a child's careful hand, written deliberately, passed deliberately, by a girl who hadn't spoken a single word. Not hello, not thank you, not even the social reflex murmur that children usually offer. She was mute, or choosing silence. Either possibility broke something open in my chest. I gripped the edge of the counter and breathed. I had 2 choices. I could call 911 right now, show them the drawing, describe the men with the earpieces and the guns under their jackets, and maybe, a patrol car would show up in the next 15 minutes, politely inquire, and be turned away at the door by men who clearly had experience turning people away. Or worse, I'd escalate something I didn't understand yet, and that little girl in the white dress would pay the price of my impulsiveness. Or I could wait. Watch. Be smart. I had always survived by being smart. Mr. Feeney shuffled past me toward the door, nodding goodnight. I nodded back automatically. The couple near the window were pulling on their coats. In 2 minutes, I would be alone in this diner with those men, and that child and whatever dangerous gravity was orbiting that booth. I poured myself a cup of coffee I didn't need and risked a glance across the room. The girl, his daughter, she had to be his daughter, had returned to her drawing. A new sheet of paper now, a different crayon, red this time. Her father was speaking quietly into his phone, his free hand resting flat on the table. Fingers spread. Even at rest, his hands looked like authority, like consequence. One of the guards near the door caught me looking and stared back until I dropped my eyes. Right. Okay. I busied myself wiping a perfectly clean section of counter. 20 minutes passed like 20 years. The rain hammered the windows. The neon sign buzzed. I refilled his coffee once. He didn't thank me, but he looked up briefly, and something in that look felt assessing in a way that was different from before, like he was revising a calculation. At 11:43 he stood. He was more imposing vertical. I'd forgotten that in the sitting interlude, how the room seemed to reorganize itself around him when he moved. His men were on their feet in an instant, a reflex so practiced it was nearly invisible. He buttoned his jacket, single button, precise, and reached down to take his daughter's hand. She let him, her crayon set down, her small face composed into that careful blankness again. He pulled $200 bills from his wallet and left them on the table without looking at me. They were almost to the door. I don't know what made me do it. Stupidity. Instinct. Some rusted hinge of conscience that no amount of careful, unremarkable living had managed to oil shut. I stepped out from behind the counter. "Excuse me." He stopped. The guards turned. I felt the shift in the room's temperature, the sudden, focused attention of men trained to identify threat sources, and me, a diner waitress in a coffee-stained apron, had just announced myself as one. I looked at the little girl. "You forgot your drawings," I said. She looked up at me, and for 1/2 second, her composure cracked. Just slightly, just at the corners of her eyes. A flicker of something desperate and grateful that she immediately smoothed back into stillness. I held out the red crayon drawing she'd left on the table. Her father looked at me then. Really looked. Not the casual surveillance of a man accustomed to being served, but something sharper, more careful. His dark eyes moved from my face to the drawing in my hand, to his daughter's face, and I watched him do the math. "Thank you," he said finally. 2 words. Still flat, still controlled, but something had shifted in the temperature of them. He guided his daughter through the door. The guards followed. The bell above the entrance chimed once, and then they were gone. Absorbed by the rain, and the dark, and the idling black SUV, I could see through the window, pulling away from the curb without urgency, the way vehicles move when the men inside them own the road. I stood in the middle of the empty diner. The paper in my apron pocket felt like it weighed 50 pounds. I pulled out my phone and typed the name of the black car's license plate into my notes app. I'd memorized it out of habit, the way you memorize things when survival is the only skill you've ever really learned. Then I stood there, staring at the rain-blurred window, trying to decide if I'd just done something brave or something catastrophically foolish. My phone buzzed. A text from Donna, the night manager, locking up at midnight. "You good to close?" I was typing back yes when the diner's landline rang. I frowned. We almost never got calls this late. I crossed to the counter and picked it up. Carmine's Diner. Silence. Then, "You looked at the drawing." His voice, low, absolutely certain, and loaded with something I couldn't name. My fingers went white around the receiver. "I don't know my name is Nico Verano." A pause, precise as a blade. "I suggest you forget you ever heard it." The line went dead. My legs stopped working. I leaned against the counter, the dead phone still pressed to my ear, the name he'd just given me echoing in the hollow of my chest. Nico Verano. I knew that name. Everyone in this city knew that name, the way you knew the names of storms before they made landfall. I didn't sleep. I lay on my lumpy mattress and stared at the water stain on my ceiling, the one shaped like a hand reaching for something it couldn't quite touch, and thought about Nico Verano. I'd heard his name the way you hear weather reports about hurricanes forming 2,000 miles away. Relevant, disturbing, but theoretically distant. He ran the Verano family, one of the oldest crime networks in the city. Not the flashy, news cycle kind of organized crime, the institutional kind. The kind so deeply embedded in the architecture of this city that pulling it out would collapse half the buildings. Judges, councilmen, shipping contracts, hospitality licenses. The Verano name moved like water. Everywhere. Invisible and absolutely capable of drowning you. And his daughter had passed me a note that said, "Help me." I turned onto my side. The drawing was on my nightstand. The one with the bars, the stick figure, the man with the gun. I'd been staring at it for an hour, and the longer I looked, the less certain I was about what it meant. Children drew dark things sometimes. Nightmares made visual, things they'd seen on screens or overheard from adult conversations. A caged figure didn't necessarily mean she was literally imprisoned. But those eyes, the deliberateness of it, the way she'd watched me unfold it, that wasn't nightmare residue. That was a message, intentional, specific, addressed to me. Why me? That question looped harder than any other. Of all the people she could have passed that drawing to, a teacher, a neighbor, the guards surrounding her daily, she'd chosen a late shift waitress at a corner diner on a rainy Tuesday night, which meant either the opportunity was simply what presented itself, or she had, in the particular wisdom of silenced children, recognized something in me. I didn't know which possibility frightened me more. By 6 a.m., I'd given up on sleep. I showered, pulled on jeans and my gray pullover, made coffee strong enough to sandblast conscience, and sat at my small kitchen table with my laptop. I told myself I was just going to read, understand who I was dealing with. Nothing more. There wasn't much on Nico Verano directly. Men like him cultivated information voids the way other people cultivated reputations, but there were fragments. A society page mentioned from 4 years ago, attending a charity gala with a woman named Ilara Marchetti, Verano family matriarch's goddaughter. The caption read, a brief mention in a real estate filing. A federal court document that had been heavily redacted, referenced in a legal journalist's blog about RICO cases that never made it to trial, and then buried in a 3-year-old lifestyle piece about New York's power elite, the kind of fluff journalism that dances around real power while pretending to illuminate it. A single paragraph. Nico Verano, 34, is rarely seen publicly, and even more rarely photographed. Those who know him describe a man of absolute discipline and startling intelligence. A graduate of Columbia Law who never practiced, inheriting instead the reins of the Verano organization at 26 following his father's sudden death. He is a widower. His wife, Sophia, died in childbirth 3 years ago. He has one daughter. I sat back. One daughter. Born from a woman who died bringing her into the world. A little girl who didn't speak, who drew pictures of cages and men with guns and slipped them to strangers. My coffee went cold while I sat with that. The grief architecture of it landed hard. I knew something about growing up in a house where the dominant emotion was loss, where the absence of someone who should have been there shaped every room and every silence. I'd been 5 when my mother left. Not died, left, which is its own particular kind of haunting. My father had raised me on stubbornness and distraction, and I'd grown up watching him paper over grief with industry, never acknowledging what was actually wrong. I recognized that pattern, the stillness of it, the performance of fine. That little girl wasn't just someone's prisoner. She was someone's grief made breathing. At noon, I went back to the diner. Donna gave me a look when I came in 2 hours before my shift. You look terrible. Thank you, Donna. Someone from last night? What? You got that face. She waved a spatula in my direction, the one that means a man happened. I almost laughed. Not exactly. I took my apron from the hook and went to work. The lunch rush was medium, nothing that demanded real concentration, which was dangerous given my current state of mind. I kept watching the door. Kept waiting for something I couldn't name. It came at 2:15. Not him. A woman. 50s, elegant in a way that read like old money rather than new flash. Silver hair cut sharply at her jaw. Charcoal coat. She sat at the counter rather than a booth, which felt deliberate, and when I went to take her order, she looked at me with the kind of direct, assessing attention that reminded me uncomfortably of him. Sarah Callahan, she said instead of ordering. Not a question. My hand paused over my order pad. I have a proposition for you. She set a card on the counter, face down. Mr. Butley, Verano requires a companion for his daughter, someone patient, someone observant. Her pause was carefully weighted, someone his daughter has already chosen. The diner noise continued around us, plates clinking, the cook calling an order, Donna laughing at something in the kitchen. The ordinary world, proceeding. She can't speak, the woman continued. She hasn't spoken since her mother died. The therapists call it elective mutism. He calls it, she paused, something flickering across her composed face. Something he can't fix. I looked at the card, then at her. Why would I say yes? Because, she said, and now something shifted in her voice, something genuine and tired and careful. You already know what it looks like when a child is drowning in silence, and you didn't look away. My throat closed. She stood, leaving the card and a $20 bill on the counter. The card had an address on it, and a time, tomorrow. 9 a.m., and in smaller letters beneath, she asked for you, by drawing your face. The address led to the Upper East Side. I'd known it would. Men like Nico Verano didn't maintain residences south of 72nd Street or east of Obscurity. The building was a pre-war limestone tower that stood on the corner of 5th and 81st like it had always owned that corner and simply been waiting for the neighborhood to catch up. A doorman in gray livery opened the glass door before I'd even reached for the handle. He'd been expecting me. Of course he had. A private elevator required a key card. The woman from the diner, she'd told me her name was Marta, house manager, the particular blend of loyal and discreet that only old money can cultivate, produced one from her coat pocket and rode up with me in silence. The elevator smelled like sandalwood and something colder. The floors ticked past without announcement. The doors opened into an apartment. No, not an apartment. An atmosphere. The scale was the first thing. Ceilings that extended upward like held breath, a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over Central Park, pewter gray with November light. The floors were wide plank walnut, dark and warm. The furniture was spare and precise, chosen to be impressive without being ostentatious, which somehow made it more imposing than opulence would have. On the far wall, a massive oil painting, abstract, mostly dark blue, with a single slash of white across its center that looked both accidental and devastating. I stood in the entry and told myself to breathe. "He'll see you in a moment," Marta said. "Lena is in her room." Lena. I tasted the name. Small, clear. Lena. She's been drawing since breakfast. The woman's composure softened fractionally. She does that when something matters to her. She left me in the living room and disappeared down a hallway. I stood in front of the Park U windows, hands clasped behind my back to prevent myself from touching things that clearly cost more than my annual income, and tried to assemble myself into something that looked less like a woman on the verge of a very reasonable panic. "What are you doing, Sarah?" I was doing what I always did when reason and instinct conflicted. I was following the thing that felt like it would haunt me if I didn't. That little girl's eyes, the drawing. By drawing your face. If she'd had enough language in her hands to draw me, specifically me, a stranger from a diner, then there was something there worth answering. The man, though, the man was a different calculation entirely. I heard him before I saw him. Footsteps from the hallway to the left, deliberate and unhurried. The sound of someone who had never needed to rush because the world rearranged itself at his pace. Then he appeared in the doorway, and the apartment, which had already been commanding, seemed to reduce itself further to accommodate his presence. He'd changed from last night. Dark trousers, a charcoal shirt open at the collar, sleeves rolled to the forearm. Casually dressed, but the same absolute control inhabited every inch of him. His jaw was freshly shaved. He looked less like a man and more like an architectural feature, something built to hold weight. He looked at me the way he had last night. That slow, recalibrating look. "Miss Callahan. Mr. Varano." He gestured toward the sitting area. I chose the chair rather than the sofa, less exposure, and he lowered himself into the chair opposite, leaning back slightly, one ankle crossed over his knee, the posture of a man completely at ease in his own power, studying me. "My daughter chose you," he said. No preamble, no pleasantry, so I was told. "She hasn't chosen anyone since her previous tutor left 6 months ago." A pause. "She doesn't choose easily." "Neither do I said. The words came out before I'd fully authorized them. I watched his expression. Nothing moved, exactly, but something in his eyes sharpened. "No," he agreed. Quietly. "I don't imagine you do." He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet, the apartment breathed around us. The muffled city, The ticking of something antique on the mantel, the distant sound of a child moving somewhere in the back rooms. "She's mute," he said, not an explanation. A fact he delivered without armor, which surprised me. Since she was 4, doctors call it selective mutism with post-traumatic components. His jaw tightened fractionally. She was born during a difficult delivery. Sophia, her mother, didn't survive it. Lena coded twice. When she finally breathed, something... He stopped, started again. She spoke until she was 3. Then she stopped. I waited. He seemed to be making some internal decision about how much to continue. She communicates through drawing. She understands everything. Don't mistake the silence for absence. She's the most intelligent person in most rooms she enters. Something almost fierce moved through the words. Pride, sharp, and protective. She needs someone who can read her, someone she trusts enough to let read her. And she trusts me, I said, based on one interaction. She passed you the drawing. He looked at me steadily. She's never passed anyone the drawing. The weight of that settled over me like cold water. What exactly would this position involve? I asked, because I needed practical ground under my feet. Daily companion. Reading, drawing, walking. Not a tutor. She's ahead of her grade regardless. Just. A fraction of something crossed his face. Something unguarded and gone so fast I almost missed it. Someone present. Reliable. He paused. Human. That last word landed differently than the rest. Quietly. Like it cost him something to say. I have conditions, I said. His eyebrow lifted. Barely. But it lifted. She doesn't get used to me unless I'm allowed to actually know her. No restricted areas of conversation. No topics she can't draw about. And I held his gaze. If I ever have reason to believe she's in danger, I need to be able to act on it. The room held its breath. Agreed, he said at last. I didn't trust the ease of it. But from down the hallway came a soft sound, a child's footsteps. And I looked up to find Lena standing in the doorway in her pajamas, clutching a drawing to her chest, watching me with those ancient, drowning eyes. She held out the paper. It was my face. Careful, detailed, accurate in the way children's art often isn't. She'd drawn me with kind eyes. Something inside me cracked clean open. 3 weeks in and I was already in trouble. Not the kind I'd feared when I'd first walked through those limestone doors. Not bullets, or bodyguards, or being disappeared into some dark Verano narrative. The trouble I was in was quieter and more insidious than that. It arrived in the moments I wasn't braced for it. It arrived in Lena. She was extraordinary. I'd sensed it from the first night, behind the bars of her crayon cage. But 3 weeks of daily hours with her had solidified something I could only describe as awe. She communicated with a fluency that made spoken language look clumsy by comparison. By our 2nd week, we had a system. I'd speak. She'd draw her responses. Quick, almost shorthand sketches that conveyed nuance, humor, sarcasm, and occasionally devastating emotional precision. She drew me yawning once when I arrived tired on a Monday, then immediately drew a coffee cup with a halo over it. I'd laughed out loud. She'd looked extremely satisfied. She was funny. She was fierce. She was 7 years old and already more self-possessed than most adults I knew. And she was watching her father with the eyes of someone who loved him completely and was frightened for him in equal measure. I saw it in the drawings. She drew him often. A tall figure, always slightly apart from other people, always at the edge of the frame. She drew him at his desk late at night, his shadow long and dark. She drew him standing at the window looking out. In every drawing he was alone. I didn't ask about the drawings, we'd agreed on that. No restricted topics, but I also wasn't naive enough to push. Some things needed to be offered, not extracted. The trouble that wasn't Lena arrived on a Thursday. I'd stayed late. Lena and I had been building an elaborate illustrated storybook about a girl who talked to birds, her idea, obviously, and the metaphor was not subtle, and we'd lost track of time. Marta had come to put her to bed around 8:30, and I'd been gathering my things in the small room off the kitchen they designated as my workspace when I heard raised voices from the study down the hall, not Nico's voice. Or rather, Miko's was the controlled one. Another man's voice, higher, edged with something that sounded like it was trying very hard to be authority and achieving mostly anger. I should have left, picked up my bag and taken the elevator and gone home to my leaking radiator and my unremarkable life. Instead, I went still. The way prey animals go still. The way prey animals go still. The door was ajar. I could hear without trying. The Delacroix shipment goes through or we lose the port contract entirely, Nico. 3 years of work. The port contract isn't at risk. Nico's voice, ice over stone. The Delacroix situation is managed. You executed their liaison. A pause vibrating with barely controlled fury. How is that managed? How is that anything other than a declaration? It's a message. Quiet. Absolute. Which was the point? Silence. I pressed myself flat against the wall, clutching my bag, my heartbeat loud and idiotic in my ears. There are people, Nico, who think you've become reckless since Sofia. The sound that followed wasn't a raised voice. It was the complete absence of sound, and somehow that was worse. When Nico spoke again, his voice had dropped so low I had to strain. Say that name again in that sentence and I will remind you why my father chose me over you. Whoever the other man was, he said nothing. The Delacroix situation is handled, Nico repeated. Your job is the docks. Do your job. Footsteps, not Nico's, heavier and retreating, and then the sound of the outer door. I exhaled silently and moved toward the kitchen, intending to vanish. Miss Callahan. I froze. He was in the study doorway, jacket off, shirt sleeves still rolled, tie gone. In one hand, a glass of amber liquid, whiskey, barely touched. He was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not the calibration, not the cold assessment. Something more uncertain, more human. I considered lying, decided it was pointless. I heard, I'm sorry. I was staying late with Lena and… I know. He watched me for a moment. Then, come in. It wasn't quite an invitation. It wasn't quite a command. It landed somewhere in between, in a register that my body responded to before my brain could vote on the matter. His study was books and dark wood and the smell of whiskey and old paper. A chess set on a side table, mid-game against no visible opponent. I stood near the door, aware of every distance between us. He moved to the window, looked out at the city, the way Lena drew him doing. Always at the edge, always facing outward. She likes you, he said. I like her. She hasn't shown anyone the storybook. I paused. You know about the storybook? Marta tells me. A beat. I like to know what she's building. The sentence had a gentleness in it that sat strangely next to the voice I'd just heard through the door, the one that had said, I will remind you why my father chose me. Both were him. Fully, genuinely him. And the contradictions of that should have made him easier to dismiss. Instead, it did the opposite. What happened to your wife? I asked. I don't know why. The question arrived before I could vet it. Some confluence of the late hour, the storybook, the way he'd said Sophia through the door in a voice that was the only unguarded thing I'd heard from him. He turned from the window. The look on his face was brief. So brief, but it was completely, devastatingly open. Grief in its purest form, before the walls go up, raw and enormous, and then, in the space of a breath, gone. Sealed behind the stone of him. Ask me that again, he said quietly, when you decide to trust me. Which meant he wasn't saying no, which meant he was waiting for something from me. My pulse had no business doing what it did at that sentence. No business at all. Outside, a siren wailed through the city dark, and inside the study neither of us moved. They followed me on a Friday. I noticed the car on my walk home. Black sedan. Different plates from the Verano vehicles, idling half a block behind me on a street with no reason to idle. When I turned the corner, it turned. When I stopped at the crosswalk, it stopped. I kept my pace even and my face forward and went through my options with the methodical calm of someone who has survived by reading environments correctly. I didn't go home. I went to a coffee shop 2 blocks east of my apartment, sat by the window, and called the only number Marta had given me for emergencies. It rang once. "Someone's following me," I said. A pause. Not surprised. Recalibrating. "Are you inside somewhere?" "Coffee shop on Mercer and 4th. "Stay there." A pause. "Don't go home tonight." The line went quiet, but not dead. He kept it open, and I realized he was making calls on another line, or speaking to someone in the room, because I could hear the faint sound of his voice giving instructions too low for me to catch the words. It was oddly steadying, the competence of it. The fact that when I'd said someone's following me, his first response had been logistics, not questions. 40 minutes later, a car I recognized, the Blacktown car, the one with the tinted rear windows and the man behind the wheel who never introduced himself, stopped at the curb outside. I walked out and got in without hesitating, which told me something about how far I'd already slid from the girl who'd valued unremarkable. He was in the back seat. I sat beside him because there was no other option and tried not to notice how the car felt smaller with both of us in it. "They're Delacroix," he said without preamble. "Someone told them you matter to Lena." I absorbed that. Someone told them. "There's an information problem in my organization." His jaw was set. "I'm aware of it. A spy. A liability." He looked at me. "You need to move. Temporarily. Move. My property in Westchester. Lena is being relocated tomorrow regardless. It's more secure. You'd be with her." He paused. "You'd be safe." I looked at the city rolling past the windows. My city. The corner diner. The yellow glow of the bodega on my block. The ordinary architecture of my ordinary life. 3 weeks ago, I'd been wiping down a counter at 11 p.m. and dreaming about nothing. "You're asking me to walk deeper into something I should probably be running from," I said. "Yes. No apology in it, just honesty." "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment. The car moved through an intersection and the lights of the city swept through the windows, illuminating his face in segments. Jaw, cheekbone, the dark of his eyes. "Because Lena needs consistency," he said. "And because you, Miss Callahan, are apparently the first person in 3 years she's decided to trust." He paused. "And because putting you back in your apartment tonight would be irresponsible." Not because I want you near me, but the way his voice inhabited the silence around the words he chose made something in my chest tighten. "You said there's a spy," I said carefully, "in your organization." "Yes." "And you're sure it isn't Marta? Something that might have been, in different lighting in a different universe, amusement, moved across his face. "Marta has been with my family since I was 8 years old. She changed my bandages after my first scar." He touched, briefly, the line at his jaw. "She's not the problem." "Then who?" "That's what I'm working on." I looked down at my hands. "If I come with you to Westchester, I need to be able to leave, not a prisoner." He looked at me sharply. "I'm saying it plainly," I continued, "because Lena drew herself in a cage, and whatever she meant by it, she's not a prisoner." The words came out fast and hard, the first crack in his control I'd witnessed directly. "She's protected. There's a difference. Not always to the person inside the protection." The silence that followed was enormous. He looked away from me, out the window. A muscle in his jaw moved. When he spoke, his voice had come down from the hard edge. Quieter. Closer to something real. "She told you that. In the drawing. She told anyone willing to look." Another silence. Longer. The city moved. "You can leave," he said finally. "Whenever you want. A car available to you at any time. Your choice." He turned back and his eyes were different, strict of something I couldn't name what. "But I'm asking you to stay. For her. For her. Not for me." He was careful about that. I noticed. We pulled through a gate I hadn't seen approaching. Stone pillars. A long drive lined with old oaks, and the Westchester house materialized from the dark like something between a fortress and a home. 3 stories, stone and glass, floodlit in a way that was both beautiful and tactical. Marta was on the front steps with Lena, who was in her winter coat and holding her sketchbook, looking up at the car's headlights with wide eyes. When I stepped out, she walked straight to me. Not to her father, to me. And slipped her small hand into mine with the total, undefended trust of a child who has decided absolutely that you are safe. Her father stood a few feet away and watched us, and the expression on his face, private, unguarded, caught between relief and something he wasn't ready to name, lasted only a second before he turned back toward the house. But I saw it, and it terrified me far more than the black sedan had. He stood at the second-floor window long after the house had gone quiet. Below, the grounds lay under thin November frost, the security lights casting cold circles on the stone path. His men moved their perimeter rotations with the silent efficiency of machines he'd built and maintained for 15 years. The Delacroix response was coming. He'd felt it gathering since the moment he'd ordered the execution of their liaison, a man named Cassine who had been feeding information to 3 different parties simultaneously, and whose death was both necessary and, Nico acknowledged to himself in the privacy of this quiet room, a provocation. He was not reckless. The accusations of men who confused grief with recklessness were their own projection. He had always been, precise. But precision and ruthlessness were not the same as invulnerability, and he had, in the last 3 weeks, introduced a vulnerability so obvious that he was still trying to decide if it had been decision or surrender. Sarah Callahan. He turned the name over with the same methodical attention he gave to everything that mattered. She'd been a variable he hadn't anticipated. His daughter's choices usually aligned with his own assessment of trustworthy people. But Lena had always been intuitive in ways that exceeded his calculations. And Sarah had arrived in that diner with eyes that noticed too much, and hands that moved with a steadiness that said, "I've held myself together through things I won't tell you about." He'd done his research. Of course he had. Letting anyone into proximity with Lena required full background, full family history, full profile. What he'd found on Sarah Callahan had been unremarkable on the surface. A woman who'd shrunk herself into a small, careful life with what he recognized, having constructed similar architecture in himself as intentional protection, a childhood in foster care after maternal abandonment, and a father who'd worked himself to an early grave. A scholarship she'd had to defer when the money ran out, a history of doing the hard thing quietly without recognition or expectation of it, the kind of person who, when a child passed them a drawing that said "help me," didn't panic, didn't perform, and didn't look away. He'd found himself thinking about her at inopportune moments, during the Cassin decision meeting, during the docs restructuring, during the phone call with his lawyer in which he'd spent 45 minutes discussing asset protection, and found himself completely unable to concentrate. He'd attributed it initially to the novelty of having a non-professional in the household, someone who looked at him without the calculation of employment, without the weight of history or obligation, someone who pushed back. If I ever have reason to believe she's in danger, I need to be able to act on it. He'd been saying agreed to condition lists his entire career. Most of them meant nothing, courtesies to smooth transactions. That one had meant something. He'd felt it when he said it, and he'd disliked feeling it, and he'd filed the discomfort in the same cabinet where he kept his grief and his fear and all the other things he'd elected not to look at. The problem was, the cabinet was getting full. I couldn't sleep. The room they'd given me was beautiful and strange. A guest room on the 2nd floor, white linen and old wooden floors, a window overlooking the east garden, more comfortable than anything I'd slept in years. I lay in the middle of the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around me. At 2 a.m, I heard Lena. Not a cry. She didn't make those kinds of sounds. It was the floorboard outside my door, the small, unmistakable weight signature of a child creeping in the dark. I was up before I'd consciously decided to be, crossing the room and opening the door. She was standing in the hallway in her nightgown, sketchbook under her arm, looking at me with an expression that wasn't fear exactly, but the adjacent thing. The particular wide-awake alertness of someone whose sleep had been full of something bad. "Come here," I said quietly. She came in. We settled on the window seat, her back against my side, sketchbook open, the half-moon over the frost-white garden providing just enough light. She drew for a while. I let her. This was something I'd learned in 3 weeks. The drawing wasn't avoidance. It was arrival. She drew until she got to what she was trying to say. She showed me the page, 2 figures, a tall one and a small one, standing together. Around them, on all sides, she'd drawn jagged shapes I recognized from her previous vocabulary: threats, men with guns, sharp edges. Then she'd drawn a third figure on the outside of the jagged circle. A woman. Me. In the drawing, I was facing the jagged shapes, standing between them and the father-daughter figures inside. I looked at it for a long time. My throat felt tight. "You're worried about him," I said softly. "Your dad." She looked up at me. Slowly, with the exquisite care of a child making sure she is understood, she nodded. "He's worried about you too," I told her. "That's why we're here." She turned to a new page, drew quickly, showed me a closed door with a person on either side of it. "He won't let anyone in." "I know," I whispered. Another page, another quick drawing. The tallest figure I'd ever seen her draw him, then a question mark above his head. I understood it so completely, my heart ached. "Does he let you in?" Before I could answer, a sound from below cut through the quiet, sharp and wrong. Glass breaking, then shouts. Then, unmistakably, the flat crack of a gunshot. Lena's hand closed around my wrist. My blood went to ice. The house became chaos in a matter of seconds. Shouting from below, the heavy thunder of boots on stairs, doors slamming in sequence, a language of emergency I didn't speak but could feel in my teeth. Lena's grip on my wrist was iron tight. I pulled her against me, off the window seat and toward the interior wall, away from glass, away from sightlines, the way you move when everything you have is worth protecting. The door opened. One of Nico's guards, the one I'd mentally nicknamed Stoneman for his expression, appeared in the frame with an earpiece crackling. "Miss Callahan, you and Lena need to come with me, now." "What happened?" "Perimeter breach. East Garden." The East Garden. The garden I'd been looking at 30 seconds ago. I grabbed Lena's sketchbook, tucked it under my arm. She would want it, would need it. And in a crisis, the small acts of care are the ones that keep children from the edge of terror. She looked up at me with a face of extraordinary control for someone 7 years old. I gave her what I hoped was a steady look. "I've got you," I said. "Stay with me." She nodded. Her hand stayed in mine. We moved, through the hallway, down the back staircase rather than the main, through the kitchen with its cold tile and its smell of pine cleaner, toward what I realized was a reinforced door at the back of the house, 3 more guards in the corridor. The Verano operation, when activated, was a different creature from the quiet, domestic one I'd been witnessing. Faster, more mechanical, more terrifying. Nico appeared from a side corridor just before we reached the door. He was in a different mode entirely. The man I'd been carefully, dangerously building a picture of, the whiskey and chess, watching from the window, "Ask me when you decide to trust me, man," was not the man I saw now. He was wearing that other version like a second skeleton. Hard and immediate and absolute, dark eyes moving through the corridor with the sweeping efficiency of someone reading a battlefield. He crossed to Lena first, crouched in front of her, both hands on her face, and searched her expression with something so raw and urgent that I had to look away from the intimacy of it. She touched his jaw, once, with her small hand. Her version of, "I'm okay." He straightened and looked at me. "You're unhurt." "Yes." I held his gaze. "What's happening?" "One of the Delacroix scouts got through the east wall. He's been contained." A pause. "There were 2. The second got away." "Got away, which means they know the layout." His jaw was tight. "We need to move the house position in 48 hours. "Move where?" "Somewhere safer." He looked at me with an expression that was simultaneously asking and informing. "I need to know if you're still. I'm not leaving her." The words arrived so fast, I didn't have a chance to be surprised by them. "Whatever you're deciding, I'm not leaving Lena." Something moved across his face. Brief. Undeniable. He looked down at Lena, who had been watching this exchange with focused attention. He said something to her in Italian, quiet, just for her, and she pulled his hand and put her cheek briefly against it, then looked up at me with steady, decided eyes. She chose me. She's still choosing me. I felt it land. They relocated us to a safe suite on the 3rd floor while the guards cleared and secured the grounds. Nico remained downstairs. I sat with Lena on the wide bed, reading to her. One of the picture books we brought, about a lighthouse keeper who kept the light burning so ships wouldn't lose their way. She fell asleep between one paragraph and the next, the sketchbook under her hand, her face finally, mercifully, the unclouded face of a sleeping child. I watched her breathe for a while. Then I went to find him. I knew it was probably foolish. I knew the version of him that had just organized a security response to a perimeter breach was not a version that needed to be sought out for. What? Comfort? Conversation? Whatever the conversation was that we'd been building toward for 3 weeks in measured, careful increments, I went anyway. He was in the kitchen, alone for the first time in hours, standing at the island with a glass of water, just water. Both hands braced on the counter, head bowed. The guards were outside. Marta was upstairs. The house was quiet again, but the quiet was the exhausted kind, post-emergency, when adrenaline leaves its residue. He heard me come in but didn't look up. "She's asleep," I said. "Good." His voice was stripped down. The architecture of control still present, but thinner. Something showing through. I came and stood on the opposite side of the island. He didn't move. "Who was your spy?" I asked. He looked up then. His eyes were tired in a way that his face wouldn't usually admit. "Caruso, my head of logistics for the North Docks." A pause. "He's been managed." Managed. I chose not to ask what that meant. "I need you to know," he said quietly, "that what I do, what I am, it doesn't touch her. I've made sure of that. She lives in the protected part of all this. She always will." "She knows more than you think she does," I said, gently. "She's 7, not blind." He was quiet. "She drew you tonight," I continued, standing alone, surrounded by threats. "She drew a question mark over your head." I held his gaze. "She wants to know if you're okay. She's been wanting to know for a long time." The silence stretched, and then, without moving, without any dramatic shift, he just looked at me. No calibration, no assessment, just the look of someone who has been carrying something alone for so long that someone else acknowledging it feels like being heard for the first time in years. He reached across the island, his hand covered mine. Not a move, not a moment, just contact. Warm and certain and unbearably human. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." I didn't pull my hand away, and neither did he. The betrayal didn't come from where I expected. It came from me, or rather, it came from someone who knew me and used what they knew in a way I had never anticipated, because the people who shape your past have a particular leverage over your present that no amount of careful, unremarkable living can entirely neutralize. His name was Daniel Holt. My mother's second husband. The stepfather I'd acquired briefly at age 9, lost at 12 when she left him too, and never thought about if I could help it. He'd tracked me down 6 weeks ago before any of this, with a phone call I'd declined and a voicemail I'd deleted. I hadn't thought about it since. Old history. Closed rooms. I hadn't known he was working for the Delacroix. Marta found the photograph on Monday morning. Passed under the service entrance door, no explanation. It was me and Nico in the Westchester kitchen, his hand over mine. Taken through the window, time-stamped, with a note on the back in handwriting I recognized with a cold, falling sensation in my stomach. She's been feeding them information about the layout. Check her background. DH. I found out about it when Nico called me into his study with a face like a closed fist. He laid the photograph on the desk between us, said nothing. I looked at it, looked at him, understood, with terrible clarity, what it looked like. "I didn't give anyone information," I said. "The photograph was taken from the East Garden." His voice was back. The stone version, the absolute version, the same breach point the scout used. "Daniel Holt is my former stepfather." I forced my voice to stay level. I haven't had contact with him in 15 years. He left me a voicemail 6 weeks ago. I didn't return it. He knew the layout of this house, which I didn't. I pressed my hands flat on the desk. I've never been here before last week. Check my phone records. Check my email. Check everything. I'm asking you to. He looked at me for a long, measured moment. The silence was the most dangerous kind. The kind that happens while someone decides whether or not to believe you, when the outcome of that decision will determine everything. Why would he do this? Miko said at last. Because he wants leverage over someone. I held his gaze. And I'm apparently the lever. Another silence. Then lower. How do you feel about that? It was such an unexpected question, so human, so far from the operational, that it caught me completely off guard, and for a moment my composure wobbled. Betrayed, I said honestly. Frightened. And furious that someone I never trusted still managed to find a way to use me. He watched me, and I watched him watching me. Searching for the moment he decided I was lying. Bracing for it the way you brace for something you know will hurt. It didn't come. He picked up the photograph. Held it. I believe you, he said finally. The relief hit me in a wave so strong I had to grip the desk edge. It was followed immediately by something more complicated. The recognition that his believing me mattered beyond tactics, beyond safety. It mattered personally. Deeply. In the kind of way that is terrifying because it means you've allowed someone past the perimeter you'd been maintaining so carefully. Nico. I used his name for the first time. Deliberately, he looked up. She drew herself in a cage, in the diner, the first night. I said it slowly. I've been thinking about what she meant. And I think... I stopped. Started again. She wasn't drawing a literal cage. She was drawing the silence, the isolation, the way love that's only protection, without warmth, without presence, without being seen, can feel like a cage even when it's well-intentioned. The study was very still. She needs more than protection, I continued. She needs you to let her see you. Not the fortress, not the perimeter. You. His jaw worked, something in his chest. I could see it, the movement of it, the way he breathed against it. Sophia used to say, he said, very quietly, that I was better at building walls than rooms. It was the first time he'd offered her to me willingly. No asking, no conditions. She wasn't wrong, I said, just as quietly. He almost smiled. It didn't fully form, got intercepted by 15 years of practice control. But the ghost of it was there, and it was the most beautiful thing I had seen in a long time. He came around the desk, not fast, not aggressive, the way you move towards something you've decided on after a long time of deciding. He stopped in front of me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, the particular gravity of a person who fills the space around them even when they're being, for once, entirely still. Tell me to back up, he said, low, careful. Eyes dark and direct and waiting. I didn't. He lifted his hand and touched my face, just the edge of his thumb along my cheekbone, the way you touch something you're not sure you're allowed to want. And the contact after weeks of charged proximity and careful distance was extraordinary, quiet and enormous at the same time. Sierra, he said, just my name. The way he said it made me feel like it was the first time anyone had said it with the intention of keeping it. I closed the remaining distance between us. His mouth found mine. It wasn't desperate. It was the opposite. Slow, certain, profound in the way that first kisses are when they arrive after too much waiting and too much fear. His hands came up to hold my face, and I felt the full weight of him, the darkness and the grief and the ferocious, barely leashed tenderness, all of it, all at once. When we finally broke apart, the room was darker. The city outside had gone quiet, a sound from the doorway. We both looked. Lena stood there in her nightgown, sketchbook open, a fresh drawing held toward us. Two figures, standing together. No cage, no bars. The first drawing she'd ever made without jagged edges around it. The Delacroix made their move on Wednesday. Not with scouts this time, with intention. 3 vehicles, coordinated entry points, a move timed for the shift change in the guard rotation that told Nico, in the cold, tactical silence of the operations room in the Westchester basement, that whoever had given them the schedule had been inside for longer than Daniel Holt. There was a second spy, someone deeper. The name came at 6 a.m., 40 minutes before the attack. Nico received it from a source I wasn't introduced to, read it in the kind of terrible stillness that precedes violent weather, and said one word, Romano. I didn't know the name then. I'd learn it later. Marco Romano, Nico's second in command, his father's oldest appointment, a man who had sat at the Verano table for 20 years and had apparently been sitting at another table simultaneously for the last 18 months. Nico had trusted him the way you trust the ground, without thinking about it, because the alternative was paralysis. The betrayal was architectural. It came down through everything. He gave the evacuation order in a voice that was the flattest, most controlled thing I'd ever heard. And I understood for the first time what it costs a person to be that controlled when what they want to do is burn the world down. Lena and I went to the south wing with Marta and 2 guards. I carried Lena's sketchbook and 1 change of clothes for each of us and nothing else, because there wasn't time. Lena held my hand and matched my pace exactly, her face set with that extraordinary composure of hers, the composure that I now understood was not distance but depth. She felt everything. She contained it with more grace than adults half a century older than her. The first vehicle hit the east gate at 6:47. I know the exact time because I was looking at my phone when the sound reached us. A concussive thud that resonated through the house walls like a drumbeat. Lena pressed into my side. One of the guards spoke rapidly into his earpiece. Marta crossed herself. We moved again. Faster now, toward the interior panic room, a reinforced suite I hadn't known existed until Marta keyed it open behind a bookcase that I would, in any other circumstances, have found entirely too thriller novel to be real. But real it was. Steel door, camera feeds, first aid, communications array, and a backup power system that hummed on automatically in the silence. The door sealed. I sat on the floor with Lena between my knees, her back to my chest, both of us watching the camera feeds on the wall monitor, the house exterior, the driveway, the east garden, the front gates, all of it playing in gray-green night vision while the sound of gunfire came in muffled through 3 inches of steel. Lena opened her sketchbook. I would have tried to stop her. Too dim, too dangerous, too much. But I understood her well enough by now to know that drawing was how she stayed here, in herself, rather than shattering. So I held the book steady for her and watched the cameras. And I watched for him. He moved through the east corridor with 2 men and a certainty that had nothing to do with fearlessness. He was afraid. He was not the kind of man who denied his own fear, only the kind who had learned, very young, that fear and action were not mutually exclusive. His father had taught him that. Cowards wait for the feeling to pass, the old man had said. The night he'd sent 14-year-old Nico to sit in an empty warehouse as a lesson in nerve. Strong men move through it. Romano had betrayed him. Romano, who had taught him backgammon. Romano, who had been at Sophia's funeral, who had given the eulogy with tears that were apparently, Nico absorbed this, with a cold, internal violence he would never fully process, genuine even then. Even in the middle of whatever negotiation Romano had already been conducting with the other side, he found Marco Romano in the East Garden. The conversation was brief. Nico did not shout. He did not perform. He said what needed to be said in a voice that was almost gentle, because real power doesn't need volume. And because he had been raised to understand that control in its highest form is the complete absence of excess, Romano tried to explain. Justifications, grievances, financial pressures, the architecture of betrayal which is always recognizable, always self-serving, always smaller than the damage it causes. Nico listened. He was known for listening. Then he gave the order. He walked back through the house with his hands steady and his mind already on the next thing. The next decision. The next decision. Because that was how you survived this life. You moved forward through the wreckage without stopping to look at what the wreckage used to be. He was halfway up the south staircase when it hit him. Not the Romano business. He'd been braced for betrayal as a category since he was old enough to understand the word. What hit him was simpler and more destructive than that. She's behind that door, Sarah. His daughter. The particular specific gravity of the two of them together. The impossible, real thing that had happened in his study and his kitchen and in the careful daily fabric of the last 3 weeks. And the unasked, unresolved question that the next few minutes would answer, whether she stays. He stood in the stairwell for 3 full seconds with his eyes closed. Then he moved. The door unsealed at 8:12 a.m. He came through it with blood on his sleeve. Not much, a cut from broken glass, Marta would tell me later. And his face was the most human it had ever been. Bare. Exhausted, the fortress so completely down that what was underneath it was almost too much to look at. Lena was out of my arms before the door had fully opened, running the 3 steps between us and colliding with him, her arms around his waist, her face pressed into his chest. He caught her, both arms, completely, none of the careful, measured tenderness I'd seen before. Just holding. The unself-conscious, total hold of a man who has just been reminded what matters. His eyes found mine over her head. I walked to him, and in the doorway of the panic room, with the house still echoing its aftermath, and the gray November light coming through the one small window, I put my hand against his face, the way Lena had, that first night, and I felt him exhale. "It's over?" I asked. "This part," he said, "this part is over." Not a clean answer, not a promise that the danger was gone forever, that his world would quietly reform itself into something safe and simple. He didn't make false promises. I knew that about him by now. The way I knew the line of his jaw and the weight of his hand and the specific sound of his voice when something had broken through the stone. But this part is over was real, and real after everything was enough to stand on. Lena pulled back and looked up at him. Then at me. Then back at him, with the expression of a child who has been drawing something for a long time and has finally gotten it right. She opened her sketchbook, still in her hand, always in her hand, and showed us both, 3 figures, the tall one, the small one, and me. No edges around them. No bars, no guns, no jagged threats at the periphery, just 3 figures, standing in what she'd drawn as a house, worn lines, a window with light in it, something growing in the garden. Below it, in her careful, uneven letters, home. I couldn't speak. I pressed my fingers to my mouth. Nico looked at the drawing for a long time, then he looked at me with eyes that were wet, just slightly, just at the edges. And the sight of that, the specific devastation of seeing a man like him brought to the brink of tears by his daughter's 7-word crayon manifesto, undid me completely. "Sierra," he said, and this time it wasn't just my name, it was an answer. I stayed. I want to be honest about what that means. Because love in the dark is not the same as love in the light. It is more specific, more demanding, and more real for all its difficulty. I stayed knowing what he was. Not because I'd learned to overlook it, but because I'd come to understand the difference between the violence of ambition and the violence of protection. And because somewhere in that understanding, I'd made a choice. His world does not become mine entirely. I keep the diner on my schedule. 2 shifts a week, because some anchors to ordinary life are worth preserving, and I keep my own room in the apartment on 5th, though I am there less and less. The balance is imperfect and ongoing and alive. Lena drew it once, the way my life looks now. 2 houses connected by a long road, and a figure moving comfortably along it. Under the figure, my name. She spoke for the first time in February. 1 word. In the kitchen, early morning, pointing at the espresso machine and then at me. Nico turned from the window so fast he nearly knocked his coffee over. Lena looked mildly pleased with herself, in the way of someone who has timed a revelation perfectly. I cried. I am not ashamed of it. He crossed the kitchen and held both of us, long and total, and outside the city moved through its ordinary Tuesday, entirely unaware that inside a limestone tower on 5th, something had been returned to the world. She found her voice. We all did.